Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. This is Jesse Weber, and thank you for joining us. Today we're covering Holly Bobo, and the reason we're covering Holly Bobo is because in a few months we are going to see the second man on trial, John Dylan Adams. Now, his brother, Zachary Adams, was convicted this past September for first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape of young 20-year-old Holly Bobo, who was a Tennessee nursing student. And now the question becomes, what can we anticipate when his brother is put on trial? And to help me talk a little bit more about that, I'm joined today by Burton Staggs, news director for WOPC HD News, and that is it's a radio station near where this trial will be taking place. Burton, great to see you.
That's great to be back.
So let's talk a little bit about the latest developments. We know that John Dylan Adams is scheduled to be on trial on May 29th. This was announced last week in a status hearing. What is the community feeling right now that the second man will be put on trial?
From what I gathered I was in Holly's hometown today of Decaturville, and just down the road, and there seems to be just the feeling it's time to get this one over with and move on. They're ready to end this.
They're ready to end this whole saga and
Yes.
Get everyone who's been responsible for this put on trial and have a verdict as soon as possible.
That's exactly right. As one of the elderly gentlemen told me today, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but it's time to get this over with.
It's interesting you say that because Zachary Adams, made a deal with prosecutors he wasn't sentenced to death. And correct me if I'm wrong, but Holly's family agreed on that. And Mr. John Dylan Adams here, who's going to be on trial, he also will not be not be sentenced to, the death penalty will not be put on the case there. He won't be sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The worst punishment he could get is life with parole. The reason I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the family says they just want to start healing, that they just want some answers to this and they just want to move on. They don't want to have to deal with death penalty or this guy being in prison. What do you make about all that?
That's exactly right. I think the deal that Zach Adams made with prosecutors to take the death penalty off the table originally was about giving Karen Bobo and her family finally getting control of the situation. And as she's told me, it's time to move forward. It's time for our family to heal. If we're ever going to heal from this, we have to go on. And something that's come up since we last talked about this is the return of Holly's remains to the family. They are not going to be returned. They're being held for evidentiary value of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation until the outcome of these trials.
So, that's really an important part. They want this over as soon as possible. That's, again, a real good reason that they want closure. I am curious, the idea that this case might be a lot quicker than we saw the Zachary Adams case. We saw the Judge McGinley say that he only expects this to last a week. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely right. If I were a betting man on this, I wouldn't bet we're going to trial. I think we're going to a plea bargain.
You think there's going to be a deal before there's even a trial?
Judge McGinley pretty much sent them off to talk at the last status hearing. He more or less just said, you guys need to go back there and talk. This needs to get over with.
It's interesting. Didn't this whole case start with John Dylan Adams? Didn't the police really turn to him, his brother, and Jason Austria, as well as Shane Austin, who was another suspect in this case, and he committed suicide? But weren't the investigators first drawn to him because of John Dylan Adams?
Yes, absolutely. They had John Dylan Adams was in federal custody. He was part of the deal to come out of federal custody was so police could focus on him.
Didn't his mother say that police coerced a confession from him, that his IQ is not up to par, so to speak, and that he was manipulated in an interview to confess?
Cindy Adams does feel that way. She's actually told me that she feels like that he was manipulated, and it should be noted that he was given, when he came out of federal custody, one of the conditions was he reside with a former police officer. And that officer is the one that called 911 to tell him he had a confession in the Holly Bobo case.
I wonder if he takes a deal, how that's going to affect that. The idea that or putting in the idea of people's minds that this was a forced confession and that he had nothing to do with it, and then takes a deal. I wonder what that might change for the Adams family.
The mother seems to be currently so adamant that her sons did not do this. it doesn't seem to me like it will waver one way with her.
How did she feel when she heard the verdict about Zachary Adams?
She went into tears. She went into denial, and she walked past me. Actually, I opened the door for her, and she kind of smiled, but wasn't too.
Yeah, I mean, there's always two sides to a trial, and when you look even the defendant who's convicted of such a horrific crime, there's a family behind there, and she now has both of her boys, one who's been convicted, one on trial. It's really tough for any parent to witness this. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about this case and mention the key character, Jason Autry. Now, we saw Jason Autry, key witness in the Zachary Adams case. We believe he's going to testify if there is a trial in the John Dylan Adams case. What latest developments can you tell about that guy?
Well, the biggest thing we got is the status hearing is that we're not going to know anything until after the conclusion of John Dylan Adams. I actually talked to Autry's attorneys after the hearing, and they told me that they would not be back in court until after the conclusion of John Dylan Adams's hearings. They even asked the judge. They asked Judge McGinley to be excused from future proceedings.
I believe that's because I think he might have made a deal, correct? That he might not even stand trial based upon his testimony.
The court documents say that he has a deal, an agreement for leniency for his cooperation.
When you heard him testify in the Zachary Adams case, and he went into graphic details about what Zachary Adams had said about the idea that they had, raped Holly Bobo, and that he was there, he was present, he was a lookout when she was shot by Zachary Adams. When you heard that, what did you think about that testimony?
It was very captivating. As anybody that watched the trial knows, he took control of that courtroom. The detail that was amazing. It makes you believe that most of it was accurate, especially when he went into the famous boom, 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 and the martins flew. And he even had it down to the birds, the type of birds that flew away.
Yeah, I mean, we watched it because we were waiting for his testimony. And I got to tell you, he didn't come off as the best person to watch on the stand. I mean, we were watching our chat rooms. People hated that guy, and they were really not happy with what they were hearing. Was there ever a part when you saw his testimony when you thought he might be embellishing certain details?
There was, and I've told your producers and I've told different people, I had his testimony since early January. I actually broke it the morning of the trial, and my report was accurate down to everything except a blanket and a tarp, and nothing wavered from what his wife told me back in January. The embellishments came on when he talked about maybe going to the Bobo home for the reason that they abducted Holly is they went to teach her brother how to make meth, and maybe the sexual misconduct, those things that came up with the brother, those seemed an awful lot like embellishments.
Yeah, it's interesting when you put somebody in the stand how things change. What do you expect if he does take the stand and there is a trial? What would you expect him to be like this time around?
I expect him to just stand in prison garb and plead guilty to a couple charges.
Yeah. And let me ask you, when we saw the conclusion of this case, and we here in the media, we were able to see, obviously, research more about the case than the jurors obviously were able to see. Can you just provide us some idea what the Bobo family went through, particularly Clint Bobo, the brother, when they were initially seen as suspects in this case? I mean, it's really tough to see, but Clint Bobo at one point, correct me if I'm wrong, was thought to be a suspect. I mean, what is it like for them to be implicated in their young daughter, sister's murder?
It had to be terrible. I've talked to several friends of the family. Clint, just momentarily, I can't imagine being in a position to be accused of my sister's murder. And there really was never anything to it. Early media accounts spun this thing in a direction that made it look more like Clint misinformed people or his account was wrong. But when you went back and looked really at his early account, you see that he was just appeared to be a kid that wakes up, looks out the window, thinks he's seeing his daughter and or his sister and boyfriend arguing, and he pretty much goes about his business. It was just a normal day.
Yeah.
He didn't know that he was seeing the what would become a national media story.
Yeah, I can imagine. And look, the jurors, we don't have their names, we don't know anything about it, but I wonder how they're doing in the community for the people that know that they did serve on that jury and what they've had to go through since that trial.
We've spoken to one juror under the condition of anonymity, of course, and he just basically told me that it was a tough decision and that he never wanted to think about it again.
Yeah, I can imagine. What do you think? The Judge McGinley has talked a little bit about trying to get a jury from another county to brought in who hasn't had that much exposure to this case, but really, this was the largest manhunt, correct me if I'm wrong, in this state. I mean, they were looking for answers about Holly Bobo when she disappeared. So isn't it kind of tough to find people who really have no idea or don't know anything about this case, even if you try to bring them in from another county? I'm talking again about bringing in a jury for the new trial of John Dylan Adams.
He did say that he would like to pull the jury pool possibly from Chattanooga, which is in East Tennessee. And yeah, it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard to find a jury that doesn't have some knowledge of this. But our statistics showed that when we researched the jury pool that heard the case originally, over 96% of them answered on their questionnaire that they had heard of this case.
It's tough not to. I mean, this case took the nation by storm. I can only imagine what it was like in Tennessee. We're getting a kind of a little bit of a view from you to hear a little bit more about what the ground level is like and the community is like. Final question, Burton. As we approach this case in the next few months, you said that it might be we might see a deal put forth. But if it's not, if the trial goes forward, do you have any final thoughts about this case as more information and evidence builds up against John Dylan Adams?
My final thought would be is things we're working on locally, possibly getting the remains returned to the Bobo so they can move on. And the family has told me through friends that they really want the focus to be on the root cause of this, drugs, and how drugs are affecting this community. And the sheriff told me a couple days ago that this case, the Holly Bobo murder, is a direct result of the drug problem in this area.
Yeah, I mean, that really is what fueled it. That was really the larger conversation in this case when you had all these people who were involved in that community and then implicated in this horrific crime. Burton Staggs, news director for WOPC HD News in Tennessee, who will be covering this case when it does happen in May, or as you said, we might be seeing a plea deal sooner than that. Again, we really thank you for coming on to talk a little bit more about this case, provide a little bit more in-depth analysis of it on the ground for us in Tennessee. So thank you so much, and we can't wait to have you back to talk more about it.
Thank you for having me.